Today is Tuesday, March 24th, 2020, which means it's Lamashtu something or other? I don't know. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? Since last we spoke, the world has become a little bit unraveled. I myself am having some issues with cabin fever and etc., and I work from home 24/7. So in order to keep myself from going completely crazy, I'm trying to find distractions away from my normal routine. Are you looking for the same? I'm kicking off the Derelict Saga on my YouTube channel. I'll be running an episode a day until we get through Derelict Destruction and, hopefully, start Derelict Trident, the fourth book in the series, which will begin on this channel whenever the book is ready. Confused yet? Good. Basically, what I'm telling you is that if you need a daily dose of a humongous tale, go to my site, shadowpublications.com, and look for Derelict. You can get all the episodes there, or you can join my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Paul E. Cooley and get one episode a day of Derelict until we exhaust the backlog. Before we begin today's episode, I do want to tell you a short anecdote and perhaps illustrate a point. I haven't been sleeping well since I returned from Hawaii. It's been periods of insomnia punctuated by deep depression, while my days have been nothing short of exhausted, intermittent periods of wakefulness in conjunction with a lot of naps. In short, it sucks. At 3 a.m. the other night, I let Luna out to do her business and busied myself with doing some things around the kitchen. I heard a sound from outside and stalked out there to see what was going on. Luna was growling at something, and it sounded as though she might have it in her mouth. I ran out there to see what was going on, and through the deck slats, I saw her dragging a screeching, hissing thing from beneath the deck. My first thought was, oh, it's a possum. This will be over in a second. I was wrong. It was a raccoon, and not a small one either. Luna had dragged the thing out into the yard and was squeezing it with her jaws. Every time the raccoon stopped struggling, she'd loosen her grip. The moment she did, the raccoon struggled and Luna would tighten down again. Perhaps Luna thought it would act like a possum, lay down and play dead until Daddy came and took her new toy away. Or maybe it was simple instinct to explain to the quarry that they were in the wrong dog's territory. I managed to separate Luna from the raccoon with a push broom, whereupon the raccoon turned, hissed, and took 2 steps toward me. Luna didn't like that, and so the process started all over again. Wonderful. Finally, I separated them again, held the raccoon down with the broom, and kicked my dog away. Luna backed off, and I moved around while keeping the poor trash panda, who was now hissing again, locked to the grass. When I was far enough away, I got in front of Luna and lifted the broom, ready to be attacked. The raccoon had finally gotten the message. It crawled into the brush as fast as it could, which was not very fast. I dropped the broom and pulled the 85-pound American Bulldog back into the house. Luna, head spattered with blood, nose bleeding from multiple lacerations, and a nice claw mark just below her left eye, wagged her tail and looked up at me as if to say, "Do I get a cookie?" Yeah, Luna's okay. I didn't find the raccoon in the morning when the sun rose, so I assume it survived. So what's the point, Paul? It's this. The world continues to move. Animals will still be animals. Luna knows nothing of COVID-19, and I'm willing to bet the raccoon doesn't either. Instinct continues, even for pets. People will still be people, and right now, more than ever, we need to be the best of people. Despite what might be happening in the world and how the news might look, your loved ones still need you. Your children still need you, and your parents still need you. They need you to talk, they need to hear from you, and they might even need to know you're just as anxious as they are. Don't spend all your day reading or listening or watching the news. Please. Go read a book. Go read the one that's got dust on it, or expend an Audible credit and get a new audiobook, or go check out a few new podcasts. Engage your mind with something else for a while. But remember, there's still a world out there that people occasionally need to hear from you in. Okay, I've babbled enough. Time for us to get back to Lamashtu. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 2 of Lamashtu.
The coffee was thick and unpleasant. John hated when Steph made coffee. Rather than use a semi-sane amount of grounds, she always overfilled the small white filter and made what she called mud. The description was apt. No matter how much sweetener he dropped in his cup, the steaming sludge left his taste buds wincing and his nerves sizzling with caffeine overload. He braced himself and took another sip. His tongue tried to crawl out through his head, but he swallowed anyway and tapped the keyboard. Steph, Linton, Al, and Blanco were back at the dig site. Steph wanted to make sure they had managed to gather all the artifacts from the hole. Linton had told her the GPR hadn't found any other material, but she was old school. To hell with what the instruments said. That left John plenty of time to himself. He'd been up since dawn, cataloging and writing reports. He was still waiting on a return email from Willett. The man was notoriously bad about following up on assignments, which is why John was shocked when the email came through. He opened it and took another sip of the black mud. Once he was through the first paragraph, his brows knitted together. "The fuck?" he said to himself. He scrolled through the text, eyes widening. When he reached the bottom, he shut the laptop and placed it on his seat. He ran toward the dig site. Dust from the wind bit into his face, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the words in Willett's email. "Utuku," he muttered. "No fucking way." He made it to the cave and stood just outside the entrance. "Steph! Linton!" Linton's voice echoed back. "What's up, boss?" "Stop digging in the dirt and get your asses out here." "Hang on," Steph shouted back. John tapped his foot and looked up into the sky. Several birds flew on the high winds. They seemed to be circling the camp. John shivered, but didn't know why. Boots crunching over dirt and stone brought his attention back to the cave. Steph and Linton stepped out of the darkness and into the light. Their faces were flushed and smeared with dirt. "What the hell, John?" Steph said. "We're digging, damn it." He caught his breath and then smiled. "What do you know about Sumer?" Linton raised an eyebrow. "Sumer? Why?" "Willett," John said. Steph's eyes widened. "Connection?" "You could say that. Willett's program flagged the configuration of birds. Carved. Buried." "Yeah," Linton said. "Get to it, John." He rolled his eyes. "All right. You ever heard of the Utuku?" The black man shook his head. "No. Kind of a Sumerian boogeyman?" Steph asked. "Something like that. And more. Utuku were daemons, spirits that were either good or evil. According to what Willett dug up, an Utuku named Alu would inhabit or possess a person. The only way to keep the Alu from jumping from body to body was to bury it deep in the ground and surround it with an eagle's sigil and feathers." "So they believed this thing possessed people?" "Right," he said to Steph. "Other Utuku, like Lamashtu, spread disease to the possessed or turned them insane. Basically all the bad shit you can imagine. But that's not the interesting bit. Willett says they found sites in the 30s with feathers and eagle sigils, but there were no bodies entombed." Linton tapped John's shoulder. "Does Willett think that was standard practice for dealing with the evil Utuku?" "Yeah," John nodded. "So there's at least some kind of cultural link here. At least that's what Willett thinks." Steph shook her head. "He needs to lay off the magic mushrooms." Linton laughed. "Totally circumstantial, John." "Agreed," the big man said. "But you got to admit, it's exciting just the same. We need to catalog every damn sigil we find. Period. And we need to try and get some kind of total. Willett thinks the number is important." "Important?" Steph asked. "Why the hell would the number matter?" "He's a fucking mathematician," Linton laughed. "When are numbers not important?" John shook his head. "No, you don't get it. At each of the Sumerian sites, they found 37 sigils." "37?" Steph asked. "How many do you have already?" John chuckled. 28 so far." Steph and Linton exchanged a glance. "What?" he asked. "We found 5 more in the cave, and we're not done digging." 33? We have 33 birds?" She nodded. "And like I said, we're not done digging." The stones were laid out on the table in neat rows. They seemed to glow against the dark black jeweler's cloth. The bright LED light on John's hat shined against the glyphs. Crude figures of the albatross and condor stared back at him. The carved sigils looked angry and watchful at the same time. The 33 sigils were all the same, carved in wood and petrified. The dig team had continued burrowing until they found another cap. The hole the body had been placed in had been sealed with a cap at the top, which was identical to the one they found in the hole's bottom. After another 2 hours of digging, they hadn't found another sigil. Linton scanned the site over and over again using GPR, but there was nothing left to find. When the dig team returned, they were coughing and sneezing and exhausted. Steph was downright pissed. "Wild fucking goose chase," she'd said as she drank from a bottle of water. Blanco and Alonzo had sat in the chairs across from her. John knew Linton was glaring at him, but didn't care. It was worth a shot. "Bullshit," Linton said. He sneezed again and then growled with pain. "Steph's right. That bastard sent us on a stupid errand." John sighed. "Look, he had a hunch, and we got real close." 33, Blanco said. "Only 4 short. Pero nada más en Guajero." "Sí," Alonzo said. "Nothing more in that hole, jefe. Nada." The dig crew had gone to bed furious, exhausted, and sick. He couldn't blame them for being angry. Because of Willett's bullshit, they'd spent longer in the cave than necessary. The sun was long gone, and the moon had yet to rise over the peaks. John shook his head beneath the lanterns as he stared at the carvings. They were similar, and yet very dissimilar to one another. John picked up the first in line and compared it to each of the others. "Carved by different hands," he whispered. In his mind's eye, he saw 33 corralled villagers, each carving their own version of one of the birds on a piece of wood. They didn't speak to one another. They didn't look at one another. Each person worked furiously, sweat dripping from their brows as their knives scratched and etched. Did they carve at the temple, out in the desert, or from the safety of the village? John frowned. The only wood for kilometers was across the valley, but that didn't mean much. Thousands of years meant at least hundreds of floods, droughts, and windstorms. That much of a toll on the hills could have destroyed verdant land long ago, or the corral could have deforested the area themselves. John put the carving back down and took off the headlamp. He clicked it off and hung the hat from a hook affixed to the tarp's bottom. The wind gusted and then calmed, but sand had already covered the table. John cursed, picked up the artifact broom, and quickly brushed off the sigils. Satisfied, he pulled another black blanket from beneath the table and covered the find. He headed back to his chair and picked up the laptop. Its surface was covered in sand. He swept it away, sat down, and opened it up. The satellite link blinked as he turned it on. With the computer on and connected, John started the email client. He told Willett about the sigils and how they'd searched like hell for the missing 4. John thanked him for his work and to alert if the program found anything else. His finger punched the touch screen. After a moment, "Message sent" appeared on the display. Willett would be pissed, or heartbroken, probably both. He might even write back begging them to search again. Just to prove his theory, he'd want them to kill themselves in the entire goddamn hill in the process. John clicked open the expedition journal. As he started to type in the day's notes about the dig, the email client dinged. John brought it up and stared at the new message. It was, of course, from Willett. "Dr. Vizcara, you said you found 33 sigils in all. However, did you find any other stones or carvings? Your first notes mentioned a cap atop the burial site. Was there another? I know you're worried about damaging the fragile stone, but can you check to see if there are any markings on the cap? Cheers." John stared at the message and blinked. He closed the laptop and headed to the table. He skirted past the shroud-covered body and unwrapped the 2 caps. The sandstone was clotted with dirt and hadn't yet been brushed. He grabbed the broom and started cleaning them. When he was done, he stared at the 2 caps. There were faint lines scratched into the stones. John pulled one of the lanterns closer. The lines became more defined. Oh, shit, he said aloud. One cap had an albatross carving, the other a condor. 35, he said to no one. He flipped over the caps and brushed away more of the dirt. 2 more sigils appeared. He shivered. 37 birds in all. 24 condors, 13 albatross. John walked back to his chair and opened the laptop and sent Willett another email. He was betting the smug son of a bitch would read it, smile, and then never ever let John forget he'd been right all along. John closed the computer as another gust of wind sprayed sand across its surface. He sighed, brushed off the laptop again, and carried it to the tarp. He placed it in the equipment crate, closed its lid, and stared at the table. The body was wrapped. The wooden carvings were wrapped. The only thing left was to rewrap the caps. His back ached. It had been a damn long day. He began wrapping the artifacts. His nose tickled. He tried to stifle the sneeze, but it was no use. Phlegm exploded from his nose and shot across the blanket wrapping the body. He stared at the yellow-green ooze and the black cloth. The snot seemed to move across the blanket. John rubbed his eyes. The oozy discharge was gone. Losing my mind, he chuckled. His fingers made short work of rewrapping the caps. When he finished, he placed them next to the sigils and switched off the lights. The world went completely dark, and John patiently waited for his eyes to adjust. The moon was finally rising and would soon bathe the valley with its pale yellow light. He stepped carefully beneath the tarp and headed toward his tent. Something rustled behind him. He turned and stared back toward the table. Nothing moved. Someone coughed and John nearly jumped. He whirled around, fists raised, but no one was there. The cough came again, and a light snapped on in Steph's tent. His heart thrumming in his ears, John grinned in the darkness. There was nothing to be afraid of here, nothing but his imagination. He unzipped his tent and stepped inside. Somewhere in the desert, he heard a bird call. It sounded like a child being torn apart. He coughed and then sneezed. "God damn it," he said aloud. As he zipped the sleeping bag around himself, he hoped like hell he didn't have what the dig crew had. In the darkness, a pair of yellow eyes stared at him. Through the moonlight spilling in from the unzipped entrance, John made out the silhouette of a short, thin man. Its glowing eyes lit a face of oozing sores and a wide, jagged mouth. The thing opened its jaws in a toothless grin. A wheeze of breath escaped its mouth, and the tent filled with a rotten stench. John coughed, but was unable to move. The visitor stepped toward him, its feet crinkling the tent's floor. He tried to sit up, to scream, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. The thin man hissed unrecognizable syllables as it approached. John's eyes watered as he breathed in the smell of putrefaction and an ancient rot. The visitor dropped to all fours and crawled up his sleeping bag. John's breath locked in his throat as the thin man's joints cracked and popped. The thing sat on his chest, but he barely felt any weight. He watched in horror as it leaned toward him, its face inches away from his own. Its hollow cheeks filled with breath, and then it exhaled, a black cloud. John found his voice and screamed. John coughed himself awake. A glob of phlegm shot from his mouth and stuck to the side of the tent. He blinked several times and tried to take a deep breath. Something rattled in his chest. He moaned and sat up. Moments from the dream flashed in his brain. He shook his head to clear the vision of the gaping black mouth and the memory of the horrid stench. The smell lingered in his nostrils. He leaned over and unzipped the small tent window. A dim glow caught his eyes. Morning, he thought. He shivered as chill air made its way through the flap. John wriggled out of the heavy sleeping bag. The cold immediately bit into his bones. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed a fresh pair of jeans from the folded pile of clothes and slid into them. As he pulled off his white t-shirt, he heard a moan from somewhere in the camp. He tossed the shirt aside and wrapped his chest in heavy flannel. He struggled to the tent entrance, put on his boots, and stepped out into the camp. The fire had long since died, but curls of smoke still rose from the pit. John blinked in the glowing sunlight. Another round of coughing broke from Steph's tent. He stretched and walked toward the sound. "Steph, you okay?" The voice that answered him was filled with gravel and pain. "John, I think I need some help." He stepped quickly to her tent and unzipped the flap. He peered in and then took a step back. Steph lay atop her sleeping bag. Sweat poured off her ashen face. Pustules covered her cheeks and forehead. The red sores seemed to pulse. "Jesus, Steph." He entered the tent and grabbed a bottle of water near its entrance. He spun off the clear plastic covering, popped the nipple, and raised it to her mouth. "Drink." Her withered lips contracted around the end and she gently sucked. After a long pull, she lay back in the sleeping bag. "Thank you." "What the hell is going on?" Steph scratched at her cheek and a dribble of bloody pus ran down it. "I don't know," she said. "Woke up feeling like I'm in a furnace." He dropped to one knee and put the back of his hand against her forehead. "Christ," he said. "I need to get the med kit. You have a very high fever." "No shit." "You're one tough bitch." Her face broke out in a wan smile. "Don't you forget it." He forced a smile. "Be right back." John walked out of the tent and headed for the crates beneath the tarp. His big hands grabbed the box marked with the red cross. As he started to leave the canopy, something clicked in his head. He turned toward the portable table set in the middle. The tarp that had covered the mummy was gone, and so was the mummy. He shivered in the cool morning air as his brain tried to process what wasn't there. A fresh round of coughing brought him back to the present. He hurried to Steph's tent. As he walked in, he saw her nails dragging across the pulsing sores on her cheeks. "No, Steph," he said. "Don't touch them." She lowered her hands and stared at the bloody skin beneath her short nails. "Won't stop itching." John dropped the med kit, unlocked its latches, and opened it. Bandages, a tourniquet, plastic boxes of pills, and a few syringes stared back at him. He scanned through the labels until he found what he was looking for. He opened the plastic box and palmed 3 pills. "Okay, Steph, I need you to take these." She held out her palm and he dropped the 3 oblong blue capsules into her hand. Steph placed them in her mouth with shaking hands. He handed her the water bottle and watched as she took a long gulp. Another cough escaped her lips, sending spittle and water onto the side of the tent. John flinched away from her and turned back to the medkit. "I need to shoot you up. You're having an allergic reaction to something." She tried to take a deep breath and set off a fresh coughing spree. He picked up an EpiPen and turned to her. Steph's left hand was raised to her cheek again. John glared at her. "Leave it the fuck alone, Steph." "Right." He pulled off the EpiPen's cap. "This is going to hurt." He jabbed the short, sharp needle into her thigh. Steph hissed between her teeth. Her right arm started shaking. John watched as the pulsing sores paled to match her skin. He reached and held her right hand. "It's okay," he said. "Just let it do its thing." Tears slipped down beneath her scrunched eyes. Her fingers squeezed. Her arm spasmed once more and then ceased. Steph's eyes fluttered open. "Better," she said. John nodded and forced a smile. "You rest for a sec. I need to go check on the others." She pulled him closer. Her breath smelled of rotted meat. "You'll come back?" He raised an eyebrow. "Of course." He squeezed her hand again before turning and exiting. A gust of wind rippled the sides of the tents. The tarp flapped. He looked toward the canopy. The sheets and plastic that had covered the mummy were on the desert floor. A chill racked him. "Alonzo?" he called as he made his way to the next tent. There was no answer. Frowning, he placed his hand on the zippered entrance. Al, I'm coming in, man. He waited a beat, but there was no response from inside. John took a deep breath and unzipped the entrance. The smell slammed into his nostrils, and he gagged. He held his nose and spread open the flap. Alonzo lay sideways on a sleeping bag. His face was barely recognizable. The flesh had slid off his bones in a gray ooze. His left eyeball lay on the pillow beside him. Bones protruded through the gaps in the dissolved flesh. John pulled himself out of the tent and vomited. He coughed, wiped his face, and stumbled backwards. He peered toward Blanco's tent. Gut roiling, John walked on rubbery limbs to the blue and orange housing. Blanco? He unzipped the tent, but didn't peer in. The same charnel house stench hit his nostrils. Choking back his gorge, he re-zipped the tent, dropped to his knees, and panted. The tents rippled and waved as another gust of wind rose. John forced himself to stand. Steph? He barely recognized his own voice. She didn't answer. He walked to her tent and stuck his head in. Steph's eyes were closed. Steph? They opened, and John started. The corneas were yellow, and her pupils had shrunk to dots. John? I can't see. He stepped further into the tent and squatted beside her. A thin line of blood escaped the corner of her mouth. Stay with me, Steph. He pulled the dirty shirt from her laundry pile and dabbed at the blood. Stay with me. He visited me last night. John cocked an eyebrow. Who? Linton? She shook her head. No. Then who? A runner of blood ran down from her left nostril. She licked her lips and groaned. Eyes, she whispered. The eyes, the smell. God, John, I've never been so scared. What the fuck are you talking about? The Atuku, she said in a broken voice. Steph coughed and a spray of blood hit John's chest. It was here. He shivered but managed to keep his face calm. What do you mean, the Atuku? It came into my tent. Steph's face scrunched in pain. A road map of blood vessels burst in her right eye. The whites slowly disappeared as the crimson flooded its surface. It was here. John shook his head. No, darling, that was just a hallucination. She coughed again, and a foul odor escaped her lips. He recoiled from the smell of rotten meat and diseased tissue. No. Steph spat a tooth to the side. Real. Her left hand, flesh sliding off the bone, rose to point at a spot behind him. The big man whirled around and stared where her fingers indicated. His breath froze in his lungs. On the inside of the tent was a small black and gray handprint. It looked wet and dry at the same time. He turned back to Steph. Her lips were open in a pained grimace. Steph? She exhaled in a deep rattle of breath. She did not take another. Steph? John shook her body. The skin on her left shoulder peeled off like rotten bark. Blood and black fluid oozed out. Through the sludge, he could see the white of bone. Steph! He screamed in her face. Her eyes continued to stare at the handprint on the tent, and her pupils had disappeared completely. John shuffled back from her on his knees. Her cheeks started to cave in, exposing rotted teeth and a black tongue. He stepped out of the tent and stumbled into the morning light.